Good afternoon. My name is Alice Walcott, and I'm going to be talking to you today about the best websites to help you teach the American Revolution. This presentation is designed as a smackdown presentation, which means that I am going to be doing a show and tell using some of the best websites that I found in trying to teach the American Revolution. There are a variety of purposes for this presentation, including to provide 7th grade social studies teachers with many different resources surrounding the American Revolution. Oftentimes, we are asked to implement reading and writing skills along with teaching the content, and sometimes it's hard for us to find those resources. This presentation is a collection of different websites that I found best to help you meet those goals. Additionally, this presentation is to assist 7th grade social studies teachers in locating resources that are going to address a variety of learning styles, abilities, interests, and entry points that your students are bringing with you. Finally, I have selected websites that address the 4 main categories of our American Revolution unit, including overview and background information, colonial perspectives, British perspectives, and primary sources. The first section of this presentation is going to introduce you to overview and background resources. These resources are secondary sources designed to give students background information and an overview understanding of the American Revolution so that they can draw upon this information as they dive deeper into the content much later on in the unit. One of the best websites I've found is ducksters.com. Ducksters.com includes a number of different content-related pages. The one focusing on here is called American Revolution for Kids. This is a great place to start for educators as there are a variety of links and topics connected to the homepage of the American Revolution unit on ducksters.com. There is an overview of major events and key people. It's also extremely accessible to students, providing information on a variety of reading levels. The next resource in our discussion of the overview or the background information on the American Revolution is put out by pbs.org, and it is titled Liberty, the American Revolution. A few years ago, PBS created a documentary called Liberty, detailing out a lot of various aspects of the American Revolution. This website connects with that documentary. It provides a thorough overview of the American Revolution and includes additional educational material such as various perspectives, and there is also an interactive game. The Kids Connect website lists out a variety of American Revolution facts, and it's presented in a bulleted format, making it very accessible to some of our lower readers as well as to some students who are looking for very quick information. Mr. Nussbaum's website is very similar in style to the Ducksters website. It also provides a very thorough overview of the American Revolution, which is one of the very many units teachers can find on this website. It divides the topic of the American Revolution into different categories, allowing teachers to pick and choose which of the information they would like to present to their students. The categories include causes and effects of the Revolution, major battles of the Revolution, people of the Revolution, so on and so forth, giving teachers the opportunity to select specific pieces from this website or to utilize the website in its entirety. It's very comprehensive and a complete discussion of the American Revolution. The Brain Pop American Revolution timeline is something I think your students are going to find very engaging. It lists out in timeline fashion many of the different events and people of the American Revolution. Students can click on each of the pictures presented to gain more information about that picture. It provides background and an overview of the American Revolution, and students can gain a conceptual understanding of the American Revolution as they view it in timeline form. As we all know, History.com is a great resource for social studies teachers. On History.com, they have compiled all of their resources into an American Revolution unit on their webpage. In this unit, they have divided their resources into videos, secondary sources, primary sources, and they'll focus on overview information, leaders, major events, so on and so forth. This website is accessible to a multitude of learners because it does present information in video format as well as text format. The America the Story of Us documentaries are very engaging for students since they see famous and influential figures from today discussing historical events from the past. Episode 2, Revolution, focuses on the technology used during the American Revolution and major events that occurred during the war. The episode also discusses major figures surrounding the Revolution. Episode 2 is accessible on youtube.com, and it connects to Episode 1, Rebels, which really introduces the causes of the American Revolution. It works very well as a two-part documentary. The Stanford History Education Group, coupled with Sam Weinberg and some other major social studies leaders, to create the Reading Like a Historian website. This website has a variety of different units, and within those units, lesson plans focusing around the historical method of inquiry and the use of primary and secondary sources for students to access and to use to gain their own perspectives of different units. The Revolution and Early America unit has many different lessons connecting to controversies, important figures, and various groups of people from the revolutionary time period. Students will analyze primary and secondary sources to determine their own interpretations and their own perspectives that address the inquiry questions. The second part of this presentation is going to introduce you to websites focusing on the colonial perspective during the war. As we know, there were many different groups of colonists living in the 13 British colonies when war broke out. Not always are we introducing our students to the many different perspectives available to them. It's important that we introduce them to these many different perspectives, including the Loyalist perspective, the role of women during the war, and the perspective of African Americans. The first resource I would like to introduce you to is an entire unit put forward by America's History in the Making, titled Revolutionary Perspectives. This unit is a compilation of materials focusing around video excerpts, primary sources, and secondary sources to introduce students to the many different perspectives that were available during the American Revolution. The unit also provides instructional help for teachers explaining how best to implement the resources available. This resource introduces students to Paul Revere's famous engraving about the Boston Massacre. The Boston Massacre was one of the most controversial events to take place leading up to the American Revolution. Many different resources will focus on the Boston Massacre, but it's important that students begin to analyze some of the primary sources surrounding the Boston Massacre so that they can form their own opinions about what happened on that fateful night. This article discusses the circumstances surrounding Paul Revere's creation of this engraving. It also explains the colonial perspective about the massacre. This site also contains links to the trial that occurred after the massacre, to the people that were involved with the massacre, and to additional pictures and resources surrounding the Boston Massacre. This resource introduces students to the roles of women during the Revolutionary War. It's important that students understand that the Revolutionary War impacted all colonists, not just white males who chose to fight in the war. This reading categorizes women into 4 different groups, including nurses, seamstresses, soldiers, and spies, introducing students to the many different roles that women did engage in during the Revolutionary War. This resource discusses the contributions of women during the American Revolution, but in a little bit of a different way than the previous resource. This resource is going to introduce students to individual women who contributed to the American Revolution. It's a much more complex text that dives deeper into the content presented. It would work really well coupled with the previous resource to give students a thorough and complete understanding of exactly how the American Revolution impacted women and how women impacted the American Revolution. African Americans and the American Revolution discusses the role of African Americans during the American Revolution. It explains how African Americans participated in the war effort and provides students with an overview of the contributions made by African Americans. It also goes into the impact the American Revolution had on African Americans. It's important that students understand that African Americans were influenced and impacted by the American Revolution, as much as women, maybe even more. This resource is an introductory list of major African American figures from the American Revolution. It's a really good starting point for teachers if they're looking to highlight specific individuals. It's also a really good starting point for students if they were to select an individual to do further research on and to either look for a biography or to create a biography on an individual. This resource is a lesson plan for teaching the perspectives surrounding the American Revolution. Students investigate primary sources to figure out their own interpretation of the events that occurred leading up to the War for Independence. Students have to decide if the actions indicate that the individuals were patriots or traitors. It includes all of the necessary materials as well as teaching instructions so that teachers know how to implement the materials presented. The third section of this presentation focuses on the British perspective. Oftentimes, in an American history class, we focus on the American perspective, almost at the expense of everyone else. It is important that we understand and that we help our students to understand that the Americans were not the only people involved with the American Revolution, that the British were also involved, and that they have a different perspective to the events that occurred. The first resource is an interview with an author who wrote the book Iron Tears. This is an NPR interview in which the author discusses the reasons for writing his book, the research that he conducted for his book, and the British perspective on the war itself. This website presents the audio interview as well as a transcript of the interview, therefore allowing teachers to address multiple learning styles in this one resource. This website is a British website discussing the Revolutionary War. Students gain an understanding of the British perspective on the war. It is a secondary source giving an overview based on the British perspective of the Revolutionary War. Students could use this resource as a compare and contrast using one of the secondary sources presented in our overview discussion earlier. This website is put out by the BBC and discusses the American War for Independence from the British perspective. It includes a much more thorough discussion of the British perspective and includes more detailed information such as the outset of war and turning points. Students can use this website as, again, a compare and contrast with some of the other overview websites presented earlier. With this being a BBC page, it is a complex text affording students the opportunity to not only dive deeper into content, but also to work with more complicated readings to strengthen their reading levels. This resource is put out by eyewitnesstohistory.com, and it is the court testimony of Captain Thomas Preston, who was the British captain in charge of the soldiers, the British soldiers, in Boston the night of the Boston Massacre. This is his court testimony, so teachers can stress to students that we probably could trust what he says in this since his statement was given under oath. This would be a really interesting resource for students to use in comparison with the discussion of Paul Revere's Boston Massacre engraving, or one of the many other widely available resources on the colonial perspective of the Boston Massacre. Comparing and contrasting those two resources, this here, the court testimony of Captain Thomas Preston, and one of the colonial resources, would be an interesting way for students to gain a thorough and complete understanding of the Boston Massacre, as well as help them formulate their own opinions as to what really happened the night of March 5th, 1770. The last section of this presentation is going to introduce you to a variety of different websites that host primary sources from the Revolutionary time period. These websites are often lists of various primary sources that teachers can access, from text to artifacts to diary entries, pictures, broadsides, poems, so on and so forth. They mostly will lack direct instruction as to how to implement the primary sources utilized, but since they are such a wide variety of primary sources, I thought it was imperative to include a few of these websites here today in this presentation. It's important that students are exposed to many different primary sources, understanding how historians do the work that they do. This first website is hosted by the Smithsonian Institute, and it is a collection of primary sources including letters, diary entries, and news articles from throughout the Revolutionary time period. This website is very easy to search and to access the sources. It also contains helpful information for teachers for how to teach with primary sources. Gilderlehrman.org has a collection of various primary sources from throughout American history. This resource focuses on the American Revolution. They place the time period from 1763 to 1783. Those of you who know, 1763 was much before the actual outbreak of war, which is one of the reasons why I included this resource. It is well organized and easy to use, and the thorough collection covers the entire time period, not just the war itself, but the events leading into the war. The final resource for our discussion of primary sources comes from the Museum of the American Revolution. The Museum of the American Revolution is being built in Philadelphia and has an opening date in the year 2017. However, they do have a wide variety of their collection posted online already. The online collection includes primary sources of poems, manuscripts, and artifacts dating to the Revolutionary time period. Teachers could use many of these different primary source items to help students gain an understanding not only of the events from this time period, but the societal impacts of the events and how people reacted to them. The last two slides of this presentation is an informal bibliography listing out the resources presented throughout the presentation.